and at the southern tip of James Bay, the settlement of Moose Factory.
Just imagine a stranger ripping you apart from your loved ones without even bothering to acknowledge your opinion, and even worse, being taken to a hell-like place, isolated from your siblings and family, made to do labor every single day, and demanded to follow a strict, suffocating schedule for the rest of your childhood days? Would you believe that this nightmare was a real historical event? These hell-like places were called residential schools. They remain one of the darkest and most impactful pieces of history in Canada.
For more than 160 years, located in both Canada and the United States, approximately 150,000 innocent children who were just trying to enjoy their lives were forcibly taken from their homes out of consent to attend these schools. While the origin of residential schools can be traced back to as early as the 1830s, the federal residential school system was first established by the government across Canada. These schools were sponsored by Christian churches as well as the government, and it was mandatory for ages 7 to 15 to attend these schools. The explicit intention in arranging the system was to purposefully separate Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children from their families and assimilate the children into European Canadian society with the goal to eliminate all aspects of the Indigenous culture they immersed themselves with growing up, ignoring their religion and spiritual beliefs, forcing them to practice the Christian lifestyle. They forbade them from acknowledging Indigenous heritage, wearing traditional clothes, or even speaking their own native language, publicly or privately. If rules were disobeyed, punishments would have to be taken. This is also called cultural genocide. How life was like in residential schools. Former graduates of residential schools claimed and spoke about the gruesome living conditions in these places. Absolutely atrocious, by the way. Upon entering these schools, students would have their hair cut off because in some Indigenous nations, long hair was a sacred cultural representation. They were also dressed in uniforms, and instead of using their Aboriginal name to decipher each student, they would be given French or English names. Or they would be referred to as designated numbers that were given to them. Absolutely cruel. Life in residential schools was not like your typical boarding schools. Students that attended received a very different education than those of royal or privileged schools. Up until the 1950s, residential schools operated on a half-school, half-workday schedule, in which students spent half their day learning minor things in the classroom and the other working. Because of how unfunded the schools were, there was a lack in education and learning resources. Instead, teaching focused more on hands-on abilities. The duties were divided between the two genders. Girls were specifically trained to do housekeeping tasks, such as doing the laundry, cooking, sewing, and cleaning, whereas boys were assigned to do the manual labor such as carpentry, construction, tinsmithing, and agriculture jobs like farming. The burdening work, which was completely unpaid by the way, was supposed to teach students critical life skills that would help them survive and excel in the future as adults. However, the reality was, the labor was more to do with managing the school at little expense, and majority of the schools would have not functioned if it weren't for the students' efforts. But unfortunately, the absurd workload wasn't the end of it. Witnesses that attended experienced severe abuse, whether physical, emotional, physiological, and sexual abuse, from the hands of the school staff. The staff was strictly disciplined with a diverse range of harsh, violent, often physical punishments, such as if they'd speak their language, some would get sharp needles plunged onto their tongue, as well as lodging, slapping, forced kneeling, strapping, whipping, public humiliation, and some who reached such offenses, like disobeying or rejecting the school's regulation, would be locked into dark, confined places, often without food or water to survive, supposedly because of their wrongdoings. The line between punishment and abuse were often broken, which made traumatized children so desperate to escape, the Mohawk Institute constructed a prison for runaways. On top of that, living conditions were in fact not far from that either. Living conditions were absolutely unacceptable. Schools would often be cramped due to the overcrowding, deficient in hygiene and sanitation, inadequate meal supplies, and poor healthcare. However, thankfully, starting in 1969, the disastrous, devastating impacts on the victims and the lives of Indigenous children were finally getting recognized by the government, and gradually, residential schools began declining in numbers. Fortunately, after nearly 30 years after the last residential school, Gordon Reserve Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan was terminated and demolished. People involved and why. The Government of Canada. While it was mainly run by the Christian communities, the Canadian federal government was responsible for funding, contributing, providing infrastructure, and overall helping create the schools. The Department of Indian Affairs. The Department of Indian Affairs and the Northern Development, DIAND, also known as Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, established multiple policies, including a policy where it was illegal for Indigenous children to join any other educational system and made it compulsory for them to enroll in a residential school under the Indian Act around the 1920s. A central figure, the Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott, publicly stated, "Get rid of the Indian problem," which significantly impacted the mindset of handling Indigenous communities and allegedly said, "Kill the Indian in the child," the goal of residential schools. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP. The RCMP was involved by assisting with the mandatory attendance, forcible removal of Indigenous children from homes and communities. If parents hesitated to bring their child to residential school systems, officers would have to act by force, arresting, threatening, or fining parents for non-compliance, acting within the government's enforcement policy. The RCMP acted mostly as truant officers. If children resulted in escaping the school, which was mostly due to abuse, poor education, and the horrid environment, truant officers, out of their will, would have to search and return them back to these schools. So many children learned to fear these officers and avoided contact. The RCMP was also assigned in the transportation of students to schools from far distances. However, it was confirmed by former students that they did not know of the neglect, abuse, and conditions occurring within the school. Churches and religious organizations. Various Christian denominations, such as the Presbyterian Church and Roman Catholic churches, were responsible for the daily operation of school and acted as the staff for the majority of the schools. They worked as principals, nuns, teachers, and caregivers for the day-to-day lives of the children, and as for the curriculum, they were the ones who prioritized manual labor over popular education. The staff was also in charge of immersing Indigenous children into Christian religion, prohibiting any Indigenous acts or culture, and played a role in abuse and neglect. Lastly, the victims. Indigenous children. An estimated number of 150,000 Indigenous children were removed from their childhood communities, who were obliged to partake in residential schools and had to experience harsh punishments and abuse. Indigenous communities. Indigenous children and communities were primarily impacted and the victims of the policy, losing their loved ones, the children, and watch as their culture is solely eradicated, leaving deep scars and family relationships disconnected and lost. How did it affect First Nations? Residential schools affected thousands of lives, especially First Nation people, and the following points are just a brief explanation of how negatively it impacted these communities and exactly how deep the intergenerational long-lasting trauma really goes. Cultural disappearance and identity loss. Because quantities of children were transferred away from their roots at a fairly young age, punishments for cultural expression and forced assimilation that they had to endure and were stripped of their identity, hair being cut off, clothes being changed a specific way to the government's liking, possessions were confiscated, and the fact that their original names were changed into Euro-Canadian names led to a drastic loss in cultural identity and the erosion of tradition and heritage. Impact on the community. The system severed family and community bonds since they were forced to be away from their families. Parents, due to the isolation, were not able to pass down traditions, and some children who were dismissed came home unfamiliar with their original environment and were told that the beliefs and what they were taught were wrong, making them feel isolated and disconnected from their communities. The sudden information created a cycle of confusion and shame that carried all the way to adulthood. The trauma affected their parenting skills when they grew as adults and apparently repeated the same cycle of abuse. Mental health. Indigenous people experience high suicide rates, suicidal thoughts, and other self-harming risks compared to other non-Indigenous communities. They suffered from mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, internal anger, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as a result of intergenerational trauma. Death and disappearances. Aside from suicidal-related issues, over 6,000 Aboriginal children died. Other kids were missing and disappeared. In residential schools, failed to keep children safe from abuse, maintain a healthy lifestyle, and etc. In residential schools, scholars were specifically vulnerable to diseases such as tuberculosis and influenza due to being unfed and malnourished in low-ventilated places. Since the food was abnormally low in quantity and insufficient in quality, budget and cost played a large role in that decision. And some children died as escapees and were discovered frozen to death in snowy fields. Others who tried to escape their abusers drowned in nearby rivers. Unfortunately, we do not know all the names of the children who died and the exact number of deaths that originated because of irresponsible record keeping and organization of churches and the federal government. Socioeconomic challenges. The socio-economic challenges hit the survivors of most of these residential schools. Since education had not been given much priority, it resulted in lower education attainment and unemployment, thereby causing these survivors to be more stressed due to financial instability. The survivors often encounter racism and discrimination. Here's a brief timeline of all that we discussed. 1831, the beginning. One of the first indigenous residential schools, Mohawk Indian Residential School, is established in Brantford, Ontario. 1876, the Indian Act. The government gains control over indigenous people and territory once the Indian Act is passed. 1883, the government. Sir John A. Macdonald, who supports separating indigenous children from their families in order to civilize them, authorizes residential schools in Western Canada. 1885, the Indian Act and its policies. The Indian Act has been amended to forbid indigenous rituals such as Sundance and potlatches. 1907, national crime. Health problems in residential schools were condemned by Dr. P. H. Bryce, medical inspector. 1920, progression. The Indian Act mandates that indigenous children between the ages of 7 and 15 attend residential schools. 1930, there are roughly 80 residential schools in Canada, most of which are located in western and northern regions. 1950s to 1960s, the big change. Residential schools begin to close as the federal government integrates indigenous children into provincial schools. 1982, rights. The rights of Indian, Inuit, and Métis people of Canada are now acknowledged and upheld by the Modified Constitution Act. 1986 to 1994, sincere apologies. The Anglican Church, United Church to name a few, formally apologizes for the involvement in residential school system. 1996, termination. The last institution has finally been closed. 1996 to 1998, justice. Abuse survivors Willie Blackwater and Norman Bennard pursued a civil lawsuit against the residential schools. 2008, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people received an apologies from Prime Minister Stephen Harper for the residential school system. 2010, the ending of a nightmare. Winnipeg, Manitoba hosted the first TRC national event. How did this event shape the Canada that we know? There are many things that formed and shaped Canada into the country we love and honor today, and residential schools are definitely one of them. In the past, Indigenous, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations people were viewed as lowlives, unimportant, primitive, violent, and overall held a closed, negative mindset to those people and continued to discriminate against them, support racism, abuse, and harm them. But because of survivors' testimonies and heartbreaking stories, we learned to change our ways. To see things in a different perspective, acknowledging and looking up to the lives of Indigenous people, and for decades now, spreading the experiences of these survivors, teaching kids and informing them about the historical event so that we can avoid future mistakes and no longer claim ignorance of this system. People now place a higher priority on individualism and culture. Racial prejudice is becoming less prevalent as people become more sensitive. In both communities and the workplace, cultural diversity is welcomed and even embraced. For example, Orange Shirt Day, which is observed nationwide in Canada, shows our support for Indigenous people and commemorates the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. By carefully selecting residential institutions, such as those found in colleges and universities, parents are more now concerned about the welfare of their children. Additionally, the students have plenty of time to spend with their families, particularly on holidays, unlike residential schools back in the days. In this day and age, people give greater priority to students' mental health. People now recognize the significant connection between mental health and student success later in life. Our education system is now more structured and aligned with future job demands, which leads to higher employment rates for students who complete their education. Considering all these positive benefits, it is definitely evident that residential schools made a fundamental transformation on Canada. They shaped not only the education system, improved parenting skills, and pursued a mental health advocacy, but most importantly, the development of respect of cultural differences. Residential schools are not merely a chapter in Canada's history. They remain a profound and enduring influence on our society today. Indeed, an eye-opener.